Welcome to another episode of the Granite List Live. I'm your host, Sally Pace, and for the next few weeks, we're bringing you a series of selected interviews drawn from our recent webinar series. These topics come from the most searched terms on the Granite List website, and I'm certain it will benefit you the same way it did our webinar audience. Covered a lot of solutions that are terms that have risen over the course of the pandemic and post-pandemic, like virtual care and GLP-1s. But this last session is one that has consistently been one of the most searched, researched, sought after solutions, search terms on the site, and that is the two words chronic conditions. And so I am thrilled that we are wrapping up our series with the brilliant Lee Murphy with Inspera Health. You're in for a real treat because Lee Murphy is the founder and CEO of Inspera Health, which is a social entrepreneurial venture dedicated to improving the health of patients with multiple chronic health conditions by supporting, and this is key, change through integrating the physical, mental, social, spiritual, and financial aspects of life. Lee has a PhD in values-based leadership and has had a wonderful tenured career in both the benefits side and the financial side. So, Lee, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Great. Thank you very much, Sally. Hello, everybody. Thank you for taking the time and coming today. And so, yes, chronic conditions is something that is high on everybody's list. And for pretty much the last 20 years, high-cost claimants is always going to be in one of the top 5 questions or strategies that people want to look at. So my goal today is to let you taste what our program does, who we focus on, why we do it, how we measure our outcomes. I'm going to move very quickly. My hope is that you hear something that says, I'd like to go through this more in depth. I'd like to understand how this applies either to me, if I'm an organization, to my clients, if I'm a broker consultant, or if there's some synergy, if you're another solution. So why do we focus on this group, people with multiple chronic conditions? Why? Because they're very expensive, and for most health plans, they're completely invisible. And so 50% of those over the age of 45 have multiple chronic conditions. In your health plan, people over the age of 50, 1/3 of them have 5 or more simultaneous chronic health conditions. We focus on them because that's where the dollars go. These are high-cost claimants, but they're not the high-cost claimants at the very top of the spectrum, the ones that everybody's looking at, the ones that may qualify for stop loss if you have it. They sit just below the radar, but they sit in that place every year. What's different, the really high-cost ones are what we would call traumas and tragedies. What they have in common is they typically resolve. Either people get better or they die, but they tend to resolve. Also, if you were to say, Lee, here's our data, tell me who is going to be in this high-cost claimant group that's a trauma or tragedy in 2030, I'd say, I can't. I could give you some probabilities, but I can't tell you for sure by name who's going to be there. People with multiple chronic conditions are different. If I start to look at data, not just in a fiscal cycle, but if I open it up to 3 years, all of a sudden this group bubbles to the high cost claimant level. 50% of the group that we target are in the top 10% of 3-year spend. 90% are in the top 20% of 3-year spend. And if you ask me in 2030, can I identify 75% of the people by name who's going to be in that group? The answer is yes. I can, because they're in that group now. You just don't know that. And once they're in that group, they don't leave. This is the combination that we look at. We don't look at all chronic conditions. What these conditions have in common is if I transform lifestyle, how you eat, how you move, how you sleep, how you manage your stress, how you follow through on your condition, I transform all of these. We also look at social determinants because if I want sustainable change, if there are social needs, they have to be addressed. And so what we know is that when you start to look at claims, the inflection point, the big jump happens after 3 chronic conditions. Yes, there's a jump from 0 to 1 and 1 to 2, but when you go from 3 to 4, that jump becomes bigger. It happens in almost every group. And the challenge is And you'll see this in a little bit. Once you have 2 or 3 chronic conditions, the chance of getting 4 or 5 is much greater than the chance of getting your first one. And so when we look at people who we would invite to our program, the subset of those with 5 or more chronic conditions, you can see how much higher their cost is. This is a sample client. The average age in this group was 55 for invitees. The average age in our program is 52. The average tenure in our program is 15 years. The average number of conditions of people in our program is 8. Picture somebody, 8 chronic conditions, 52 years old, they've been with you for 15 years. What is the chance that they're going to look for a new job unless they're involuntarily terminated? It's almost 0. So what that means is your time horizon, your cost and liability time horizon on this population is 13 years at a minimum if they're going to retire when they're eligible for Medicare. Their cost for you or for the plan over that period of time is going to be between $500,000 and $1 million. If I include absence costs, which they say is worth 55 cents for every dollar spent if you've got a chronic condition, you're going to approach that $1 million mark per person. So that liability is huge. I referenced this before. The chance of you getting another condition once you have 3, almost 70% of the population went from 3 to 4. This is over a 3-year period of time. This just takes a look and says, if I had a cohort of 25 people, if the average spend was $31,000, by the age of 65, that per member spend is going to be $600,000. That's only using compound interest. That's using a 5% trend. I'm actually including a 5% attrition in there. If I include absence costs, that's that total expected cost at the bottom. 25 cohort members are going to cost you $17 million over the next 13 to 15 years. And this group is invisible. Most people don't know who's in this group. And so if nothing else, from the 20 minutes I'm going to talk and your questions that are going to come afterwards, if you say, you know what, let's go in and look at the data, this will have been worth that 20 minutes for you. Then you can decide, what are we going to do about that? Our solution, and we've been doing this for over 25 years, this is a high-level overview. We use health claims to identify folks. We then recruit people. We do letter, email, and we follow up with phone calls. People go through our portal. They fill out the intake questionnaires. They fill out all kinds of surveys. They then meet with a health coach for typically 60 to 90 minutes. Everybody in the program has a clinical mental health evaluation. 50% of those evaluations end up in a diagnosis. Another 25% are subdiagnosis, but counseling could be helpful. So 75% are recommended for counseling. We get about 80% to give it a try. We then create a plan. That plan runs from, nowadays, it runs from about 14 to 20 months on average, a long enough period of time that we can get people engaged in change. We can watch life happen. We watch them fall off their change and we get them re-engaged in change. What makes our program different? Again, think about the population we're supporting, 8 chronic conditions, 52 years old. What changes this group is face-to-face interactions. If you're in our program, on average, you're going to have 1 face-to-face interaction a week. Those are typically an hour long. A killer app with a bot that's always talking to you is not going to change the behavior of the population that we're supporting. They need people helping them. We take a whole person approach. We do not have tracks. There isn't a diabetes track and a weight loss track and a hypertension track and a depression track. We look at each person, and quite honestly, people with the exact same diagnosis are going to have very different plans depending on their readiness for change, their value system, how much capacity and time that they have, and where their social needs are at. I mentioned before, we walk with people long enough to see that change take hold, and then we can show sustainability. I've got a slide at the very end that can document what I mean by sustainability and impact. We have to start with where they're at. So if where they're at is, look, I'm stressed out about my finances, we start there. Now, if there's a care gap that's been identified that's dangerous, we of course start by pushing them back to their provider to do that. We are a behavior lifestyle-based focused program. With the exception of mental health, we don't do any clinical intervention. Our focus is sustainable change. Our client is you, is the organization is your client. We've got to be able to measure and prove to you that we're making a difference. So our team is the health coach, the behavioral coach, and then we've got education specialists in the areas listed on the screen. Almost everybody that comes into the program is going to spend time with 3 or 4 of the education specialists. So they're going to work with 4 to 6 different people on our team. And then we're going to refer out. 75% get referred out for mental health counseling. We'll use the behavioral health network of the plan. If needed, we'll refer out for a registered dietitian. 80% get referred out for fitness improvement. 90% of the people that come into our program are completely sedentary. We're going to send them, we're going to pay for the gym membership, we're going to pay for the personal trainer. We use massage for stress management, for pain, for mobility. Anything that's not covered by the health plan, we pick up. Co-pays and deductibles on mental health, we pay for that. We do have technology in the background, but for us, it is really in the background. And so everybody that comes into the program gets a Fitbit wireless scale and a tracker. It syncs back with our platform. On our platform, they set weekly goals. There's place for secure communication. We've got about 65 education courses. Before they meet with a health education specialist, they need to take a course in a particular area. So we have some common language. We use several different licensed instruments, and once a month, we do a group education class. I mentioned this before. Same diagnosis. The plans are completely different. It's really based on readiness for change, mental health, and social needs. It's not based on what the conditions are. Engagement. The only way we're going to get people to change is if they're engaged. And so at 6 months, we've got over 90% of the people that we built a plan for still in the program. At 12 months, we've got 84% still in the plan. And at graduation, we have 70%. It's a very involved plan. It's highly personalized. And it's that personalization that creates that stickiness and that superpower. And that's why they stay engaged. So what are some of the outcomes you're going to see? Traditional outcomes on traditional measures. Here's some of them. We've got a more unique way of talking about outcomes. But when I show A1C down by 14%, that's for people who at baseline had an A1C above 7. And so I'm not looking at what's the impact on people who came in for something that wasn't at risk when they came in. The challenge when you're working with 24 different conditions and everybody comes in at a different baseline is when I'm reporting out to a client, what's your impact? I used to have one slide on each one of our measures. And by the third slide, people's eyes glazed over because it was just too much information. So we developed the MCC Health Impact Index. And what we did is we took 12 different measures and put them together so we could create an aggregate score. We then took that methodology to the Validation Institute, and they said, yes, that is an appropriate way to measure impact on health. And so a lower score is better. Our index, everybody gets an individual score. I can guarantee you that if this score is not improving, there's no chance their health is getting better and their long-term cost is going to get better. We will guarantee outcomes on this slide and on this cost or metric and on financial as well. Let me go to the next slide. So what it would look like is everybody gets a score at baseline. We aggregate it for the cohort. This cohort coming in on average was a 30.7. When they graduated, they were a 19. And so if you are a broker or consultant, we will share detailed, identified level information so that your client knows that what we are reporting and showing as an impact, you can do the exact same calculation. I don't know of any other health solution that will measure 12 different independent measures like this by person, share the results, and use that and give a guarantee related to it. So, talking about our guarantees, we have 2 of them. One is based on that MCC Health Impact Index that will guarantee 20% at 12 months, 30% at graduation. We'll guarantee a 30% decrease in claims spend on average by cohort 24 months after they graduate as well. The MCC Health Impact Index is a leading indicator. That's where you're going to see the change happen in behaviors. Cost is a lagging indicator. If I could take people with 8 simultaneous chronic conditions and turn them around so that their cost was better in 12 months, we'd be working with, the Nobel Prize people, not talking with you on a Granite List webinar. You just can't do it. You can't turn people that are that vulnerable that quickly for a financial outcome. So I mentioned additional outcomes, long-term impact. And so this was a client that we had the ability to do some additional data studies on. And so this is looking at the 24 months after somebody graduated our program, and then 24 months again after that. So I'm looking 4 years out after graduation. They were in our program for a little less than 2 years, and comparing that to the 2 years before they came into our program. And my comparison group is the cohort that we invited to our program that were appropriate, that didn't say yes. And so if I looked at inpatient length of stay, for the people that graduated our program, they dropped their length of stay by 30%, 24 months following, and they held that. It stayed 30% lower for the 48 months total. If I look at the invitees, their length of stay increased by 60% from the 24 months before they were in our program, and it increased by 20% for the second period of time. And so it's that second period of time for me that really talks about even longer sustained change. Readmissions, you're going to see the same dynamic, the same kind of thing. When I compare people who graduated our program to the people that were invited that didn't come in, longer lengths of stays and longer readmissions. And so if I look at that previous slide before, and I just drop after 24 months after you graduate our program, I drop your spend by 30%. And then I just let the inflation number go. This is just compound interest. If we hit our guarantee and we drop the cost by 30% on a group of 25 people, even with attrition, it's going to be worth $4 million. So we see ourselves as complementary, not competing with other point solutions, because other point solutions are not focused on people with 5 or more simultaneous chronic conditions. They might be focused on 1, 2, sometimes 3. They're focused on a less vulnerable population. They are either 100% digital or 70 to 80% digital. We're 10% digital. The population that we serve isn't going to be successful with an 80% digital program. And so we would see that we can integrate with these programs. We're not competing with these programs. And so why do we work? Average age of 53, 8.4 chronic conditions, 13 years. This was an actual client statistics. We know that if we can change how they sleep, how they eat, how they move, how they understand their conditions, how they address their mental health. And what we really do is we help teach people that the linkages between all of those things. Most of these folks don't realize that how they eat, how they move, how they sleep, and how they manage their stress is related to each other. And for you and I that don't have 8 chronic conditions, some of us have learned that, and it's like, oh, okay, that makes a big difference. Because if I don't get a good night's sleep, I don't eat as well, and then I skip my workout. When you've got 8 chronic conditions, that relationship is magnified. And so what we do is we teach them that. And what we know is if we can get them improving there, we're going to get them to improve their health. I'd love to have the conversation with you of how do you look at your data. You can do it. We can walk you through how you do it. You can send us de-identified. You can send us a subset de-identified. No cost or obligation. What I'd really like to do is help you see this population, because once you see them, we can do something about it. And that's what I've got, Sally. Let's go to questions.
Perfect. Okay, so there have been a couple that have actually come through the chat feature, and one of them is what types of organizations are or are not ideal clients, and they may also be asking about group size or minimums.
Okay, so first of all, they need to be self-insured. If you're not self-insured, we can't do anything. Ideally, you've got at least 2 years worth of health claims and pharmacy data that you can look at detailed level. Ideally would be 3, minimum is 2. And so group size, anything below 500 starts to get really pretty small, because the number of people that we're going to be touching is going to get pretty small. I'll need a larger group. I need at least 10 participants for our guarantees, but we can work with a group that's down to 500. Now, the other side, the other ideal group. So who's not an ideal group? A tech startup is not an ideal group because their average age is usually like 28. They just don't have that population. And so if you don't have 20% of your population age 50 and older, you might be too young, but most organizations are going to have a percentage of their folks that are at least 45 and older. Also, I need a group that has got a good culture, because if they don't trust the employer, you're talking to vulnerable people, there's no way they're going to engage with us. And the last thing I'll say, because we've had this in initial conversations, if your group requires a financial return inside of 12 months for any dollar that they make, we're not a good fit for you. This is a longer-term liability play. This is not a short-term, quick cash ROI.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the Granite List Live. Access our entire library by visiting your favorite podcast venue or subscribe on our site, thegranitelist.live.